We begin this hour with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is speaking out ahead of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's talks with Russian officials in Moscow. During a press conference this morning, Putin said the U.S. claims about Syria remind him of its claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Putin also said he heard the U.S. is planning another set of airstrikes in Syria. He claimed Russia has information that strikes are being readied on the capital city of Damascus with the aim of blaming the Syrian government. Meanwhile, Secretary Tillerson said ahead of his arrival that Russia has a choice to make with regards to its global alliances moving forward.
Russia has really aligned itself with the Assad regime, the Iranians, and Hezbollah. Is that a long-term alliance that serves Russia's interest? Or would Russia prefer to realign with the United States, with other Western countries and Middle East countries who are seeking to resolve the Syrian crisis?
Let's bring in Washington Post reporter David Nakamura, who joins us now from Washington. David, good to see you again.
Hey there.
So let's begin with some of this posturing from the U.S. and Russia ahead of these talks in Moscow. What do you make of what we're hearing from both sides? What are your sources telling you?
Well, I mean, look, this is an important issue for both sides, but if it was an easy issue, it would have been settled a long time ago. And, you know, this is really where Rex Tillerson is going to have to make his name. You know, he was someone who, as the head of ExxonMobil, did business in Russia. We all know about that. There are questions about, you know, how close his ties were to, you know, the seat of government there. But I think now you're seeing him take a much harder line than this administration had been on Russia over its support of the Assad regime. And so they're mounting up pressure from the United States side on Putin. And Putin's trying to sort of distract and deflect and say, look, we don't really know what happened. He's suggesting other motives for the chemical attack that may not even have been Assad. I think there's pretty clear evidence that it was. And so the administration is really going to have to come strong here when Tillerson arrives, now that he's there, to sort of make it very clear what the U.S. side would like to see. And I think the big problem right now for the Trump administration is that they're making clear why they took these strikes to dissuade Assad from doing any kind of similar attacks. But the broader Syria policy and Russia's, you know, sort of position in that is a little harder to tell what this administration is saying that they would like to see and how strong steps they would take in the future to sort of make it happen.
And then we've got these comments from Putin about hearing that the U.S. is planning for a second round of strikes in Syria. Did that catch a lot of insiders by surprise?
Yeah, I think that, you know, things that Putin says maybe doesn't catch people by surprise, because I think, you know, the United States thinks that this is someone who's going to say what he would like to say just to sort of distract and sort of change the storyline. Now, that's something that the Trump administration has been accused of as well. I think the bigger question, of course, is, you know, what steps is the United States willing to take, you know, with international partners or on its own unilaterally, not just to sort of put pressure on Assad, but on Putin to change his course of behavior. The big problem, of course, is that any steps by the United States risks escalation in a very difficult, confusing, and chaotic situation on the ground in Syria. There's been talk about the administration considering, you know, more U.S. troops on the ground there, something that President Obama, of course, very carefully tried to stay away from. But those things escalate. This is something that will take time. It's very confusing. And so this is the first step of that. They're trying to send a tougher message to Putin, but there's no sense right now that Putin's going to change his behavior.
And let's focus on that word for a moment, confusing. I mean, we've heard so many conflicting messages from the Trump administration with regards to Syria over the past 48 hours from different representatives in the administration. I mean, what do you make of the messaging? Is there a point where somebody, perhaps the president himself, will have to define a clear and coherent policy going forward? Let's call it a Trump doctrine.
Absolutely. Well, you know, these strikes, the chemical weapons attacks were obviously shocking to the world, and the images that came out of there affected not just people in the administration, but apparently the president himself, who was very moved by these images of children suffering and dying. And so the White House described for us like sort of basically a 2.5-day process last week in which the president relied on his national security team to sort of develop policy proposals that ultimately led to the decision Thursday evening to launch these strikes in Syria. But, you know, people I talked to outside the administration said, look, that may be a first step. It did get some support from sort of establishment voices, both in Republican and Democratic Democratic circles here in Washington, and the White House sort of seized on that to show, look, this was successful. But the bigger question people pose is, normally you have a policy, an overarching policy in Syria and the Middle East, and then you take the strikes as part of that. This was more like, let's authorize the strikes as we develop our policy. And the big question is, does the administration expect Assad to leave under all circumstances in any kind of negotiated diplomatic settlement, which is several steps down the road? They continue to talk about defeating ISIS as the #1 priority because that's an imminent threat to the United States. But with Assad in power, that makes it more difficult possibly to defeat ISIS, or does it? So those are some of the questions that need to be answered, as you said, not just by the administration, but the president himself.
And David, let's talk about a country that doesn't get talked a lot about, especially in the last couple of days. There's been a lot of discussion around the United States and Russia and even North Korea, but nobody's really focused on the issue of Iran. Right. They will have to be a part of any solution that the United States and Russia agree to in Syria. And yet, they haven't been discussed a whole lot. We haven't heard much about how we would approach them.
A very difficult question as well. This was a president who criticized President Obama's strategy with Iran on the nuclear deal, and Trump has talked about potentially upending that. But, that has the support of Moscow as well. That deal, remember, it's not just between the United States and Iran, but by a number of the bigger countries in the National Security Council, as well as China and Russia. So these are big questions, and it is, again, a very difficult and confusing situation, and Iran has its own motives to continue to sort of sow chaos in this particular conflict to keep the United States distracted and to sort of achieve their ends as well. And so, the sort of different parties that need to come to the table. This is why it's been such a confusing situation. And the Trump administration says, look, criticized Obama for, dithering and not making a decision on this, to take strikes after the 2013 evidence of a chemical attack by Assad. This is sort of announcing, look, we will take stronger measures when they're called for. But what does that really mean in the long run if you don't have the bigger strategy in place?
David, one final question before I let you go. Secretary Tillerson is obviously dealing with the Russians. The administration is also grappling with a very belligerent North Korea. The president tweeted this morning, quote, "I explained to the president of China that a trade deal with the U.S. will be far better for them if they solve the North Korean problem." What do you make of the president of the United States appearing to use trade deal as a bargaining for nuclear proliferation?
Well, it sort of combines two of his big themes here, national security and economics. But it's, the idea is that this administration is saying, look, Beijing sometimes says, look, North Korea doesn't always listen to us. We don't have the political leverage. But 90% of trade from North Korea flows through banks and businesses in China. And that's where you're seeing this administration trying to get Beijing to turn up the pressure by sort of turning off that spigot of capital and funds going into the North Korea regime. But it did not appear, though, during the summit in Mar-a-Lago over the last few days, that Chinese President Xi Jinping had made any major concessions. They sort of talked about mutually trying to sort of disarm the peninsula of Korea, but there was no concrete proposals that were, sort of announced afterward. Now, that was just the first meeting, and that's another difficult situation. But you see a U.S. strike aircraft carrier moving toward North Korea as a show of force. There's some sense that Korea is going to potentially test some more missiles coming up soon. So you're seeing this president saying, look, China understands economics. They need to keep growing their economy for their own goals. So he's going to sort of, make this threat. The question is, again, how do you carry that off without escalating a trade war, which would also hurt the U.S. economy?
Absolutely. David Nakamura of the Washington Post, as always, we appreciate it, my friend.
Thanks a lot.